You are the beautiful community. Hello, and I am Vlad, and I'm speaking to you from bed for health reasons, which I know you will forgive me. Let's say a little bit more about social and political dynamics, especially in Russia behind the Kursk incursion. What we said last time was something about the chaotic nature of the Russian response. We talked about the military response, the military being headed by Gerasimov. We talked about the counter-terrorist operation headed by Bortnikov. We talked about the committee that Mr. Belousov, the defense minister, set up, and we speculated about whether Mr. Dumin had been appointed also to coordinate Russia's response to the Kursk invasion. And there's no more substance to that latter factor. We talked about the initial Kremlin response, which is quieten things in Russia, keep on pushing in the Donbass and hope the incursion doesn't escalate, and the fact that the Russians were to a degree pushed to reevaluate that initial strategy. We said something about mobilization, and I want to say something more. What we said was that mobilization was plausible for the first time in a long time, another wave of mobilization, and that while it would be much easier for the regime to bureaucratically execute it, the opposition to it would now the systemic attempts to evade it would now be greater, because it would be a bigger snap of that informal bond between the regime and the population, that with the exception of the first wave of mobilization, the war remains optional. And we talked about Ukraine getting some, at the very least, short-term political gains, a little bit of extra mobilization at home, certainly at an emotive level, giving an impression of refreshing the war to an increasingly cynical West, giving an impression of Russia's vulnerabilities, and pushing the West to relax its rules of engagement around weapons it gives to Ukraine. And we talked about a crack in the kind of narrative developing in the West, that the longer the war goes on, the more it will go to Russia's advantage. Ukraine's incursion shows that there can be surprises along the way, and that Russia's systemic advantages aren't as great, arguably, as they sometimes are taken to be. And as far as the Russian population is concerned, we talked about only a small effect, or perhaps a kind of crack in the preponderant expectation that the war was going okay enough, with an okay enough chance of ending soonishly in the way that is okay enough for the Russian side. There's a crack in that perception that I feel was common among the depoliticized majority in Russia. So what do I want to add to that now that 48 hours have passed? Well, I want to start with an important distinction I think we have struggled to make well. And I put that down on paper, on Twitter, on X, and I just want to read that out to you verbatim. It's just 2 sentences, because it takes us to a very important place. The Kursk incursion may contribute to Putin's downfall, but it doesn't contribute to his downfall in the near future. Commentators shouldn't confuse long-term desacralizing effects on Putin's aura of legitimacy with a short-term dethroning effect, right? So, as ever, in our culture of algorithms and wanting to think one thing, it's possible to think both things. That in the long term, this introduces a further crack into Putin's aura of perceived legitimacy. And that crack is irreversible. It's just that we don't know how many cracks the thing can take. And it's also entirely possible that it can take enough cracks to last Putin's biological lifetime, right? There's no question that the thing will crack, but it might crack after Putin's gone. The thing being his aura of legitimacy. So it's possible both that little mines are placed underneath the stability of the Putin regime, and that in the short term, it doesn't suffer much disadvantage and may even gain something, right? I'm not saying that there's any kind of rallying effect or consolidation around Putin as a result of the incursion. He'd like that to be the case. But I'm saying that it's in principle possible that that is the case in the short term, and that in the long term it is also the case that this is a little mine underneath the legitimacy and the stability of the Putin regime, right? So the metaphor here is erosion, right, for the regime. And what the algorithms want us to do is say explosion, but it's not. It's erosion, not explosion. And there's, I think, another very important risk that I think as a public intellectual is my responsibility to state. And that is that some of our screams about the imminent demise of the Putin regime, premature screams, are a product of our insecurity about the decline of our own society civically and the fragility of our democracies. It's a product of our own incapacity to face with eyes wide open the pessimistic contingencies of our own predicament that is part of what drives us to scream Putin's about to lose power, Putin's in trouble, Putin is about to have everything fall apart on him. So it's a kind of a reaction to the world that fails to accept the world's trends, right? It's us trying to reach for a world that isn't there. That's a very important part. I'm not saying it's the main part, it isn't, but it's an important part of our attraction to this talk about Putin being evil and in virtue of being evil, losing. Well, evil doesn't always lose. Now, increasingly, it's clear that the political advantages that Ukraine has accrued via this incursion are real. There is no doubt about that. And moreover, the speculative disadvantages, in particular one speculative disadvantage, haven't come about. The disadvantage being that many people who are Ukraine skeptical are going to see a kind of equalization of the situation there. If Russia's invading Ukraine, Ukraine's invading Russia, well, it's now sort of ethically 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, and it's not any more clear who the good guys and the bad guys are. And I said right at the beginning that I felt that wouldn't happen in the West, simply because enough Westerners just know that Ukraine has no interest in invading Russia beyond taking what is really an emergency step in a desperate fight for its own survival and its own sustainability as a state and as a culture. So that hasn't come about, and the advantages around mobilizing folks at home in Ukraine, around refreshing the West, around loosening the West, around rules of engagement, all of these advantages have accrued. However, if you listen to the best military experts in the West, and I recommend a very good piece by Jack Watling in The Guardian recently, and I think Mike Kaufman also released another pod a day or two ago, they are still asking the question, in military terms, is the advantage that Ukraine has sustained for itself, has eked out for itself here going to last or not, right? Because if Russia doesn't end up drawing troops from the Donbass to deal with Kursk, if Ukraine loses a lot of very high value forces in Kursk, it may prove militarily disadvantageous to Ukraine. So it's clear, right, that non-algorithm captured military experts are still very neutral at the military level, right, about whether Ukraine's advantage here will be one that sustains. I want to make a political observation around this because I don't take views on military matters. And it's this: the Donbass and progress in the Donbass over the next few weeks is more important to Putin than 1,000 square kilometers of Russian territory. It's more important to Putin than 10,000 square kilometers of Russian territory. Moreover, there is a certain sense in which, for Putin, the people who have had to be evacuated out of the Kursk region don't exist ethically. They don't exist for Putin, really. And they exist more for the depoliticized Russian population, but also not much. So understand the indication of priority there. Understand how much more committed Putin is to continuing to grind out small advances in the Donbass as a priority that's much greater than pushing Ukraine out of Kursk for him. Now, giving a role to Mr. Dumin, who used to be Putin's personal head of security and used to be a governor of a region, is, I think, perhaps risky for Mr. Dumin because you don't want to be indicated as a possible candidate for gossip about succession too early. It'd be a poisoned chalice. What it really affirms is the degree to which that regime and Mr. Putin himself deals with people not in terms of designated roles, but in terms of designated scales of importance, right? So, the ice cream maker will be made to cook the soup, not because the ice cream maker is good at cooking soup, but because the relative scales of importance that people in the regime have gives Putin the logic that you should put the ice cream maker on the soup and the soup maker on the ice cream. It's a very typical feature of Putin's regime. I wanted to add one further bit of analysis on mobilization in Russia. If mobilization, another wave of mobilization doesn't happen, and it would be difficult for Putin to do it, he would get away with it, almost certainly, but it'd be difficult, then a good question arises: to what extent might we not see the national service draw in autumn as a form of mobilization, if for the first time national service kids are going to be thrown into combat? It's just not necessarily going to be combat on Ukrainian territory, it might be combat on Russian territory. But it's possible that, to a good extent, that national service draw in autumn could be itself a form of mobilization. As the US election approaches, I'm going to give you an update of my altered sense of what's the likely outcome in a separate video. But what I want to say now is that we shouldn't underestimate the degree to which both administrations, the Harris and the Trump administration, are going to be feeling a lot of pressure to bring the war to a stop. Now, we've already discussed how in the case of a Harris administration, this is much more likely to be done sustainably and constructively, or not at all. And With the Trump administration, it's more likely to be done unsustainably and unconstructively. But don't make the mistake that Trump's the guy who is want to stop the war, and Harris is the administration that's going to give Ukraine further support to continue fighting. That may well happen, but the Harris administration will be under considerable pressure, in my opinion, to try to bring the war to a close. Now, I don't think we need to correct this, but I mean, I will, just to be really pedantic. In the last video, just through my health condition, the Russian soldiers who were taken prisoner in the Kursk area by the Ukrainian incursion, I said they were taken hostage, which was just a slip of the tongue. They're not hostages, they are taken prisoner in a legitimate way in a war. And I'm always in two minds when I slip up, because I slip up a lot due to my health condition. And it's important to not say inaccurate things. On the other hand, we live in an absurdly literal-minded culture, and it's also very important to rebel against that to some extent, right? As long as the slip isn't manipulative or deliberate. That's enough for today. I will keep trying to add value as the situation develops. Lots of love.